and welcome to EnergyTech Essentials from the Net Zero Technology Centre. This is a series of episodes where we pull in some expert partners who could help startups on their journey as they're navigating building an energy tech business, whether that is trying to raise investment, whether that's trying to build a technology, or today we're going to be talking about maybe that's how to build your customer relationships. So today's session is all about how we use storytelling, communication techniques to get the most effective way of trying to engage with your customers. We're joined today by Bob and Derrick from AB15. How are you both?
Great. Yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah, excellent.
Excellent. Well, Bob and Derrick, with their many years of experience, both in industry and in working with TechX, all the way from, I think, cohort 1, if I'm right, from you both.
Yeah.
They have worked with a lot of our fantastic energy tech startups. And it's not lie to say that it is almost every year, I'm pretty sure, the highlight of the program from the startups. It is always spoken about so positively, the support they get from you both and how they develop their communication skills. So in today's session, for the startups who've been through TechX and lucky enough to have develop their pitch with Bob and Derrick, this is going to take us a little bit further along the journey to say, well, how do we keep using those skills? But if you've never had the joy of working through the storytelling approaches, we'll also give some tips and tricks, I'm sure, that other startups who have applied to TechX or who haven't been through it can pick up upon. So maybe Bob and Derrick, I'll kick off with yourselves. Feel free to give a little bit more of an introduction if you want to, but equally a starting question is, you've worked with a number of our energy tech startups and other startups and other programs too. So what is an example of an experience where one of those startups has been able to use those business storytelling techniques to help them in their commercial approaches?
Yeah, I guess there's a number of different examples we could use, Edward. One that comes to mind, and I can't remember which cohort it was, but I remember distinctly when they came in to do the pitch as part of the selection process. And they brought in a box of tricks with pipes coming out of it and things like this. And I thought, this was something like a 3-minute pitch. And I thought, well, this is going to be interesting to see how they can present their idea and do something with this, what looked like a complicated bit of equipment. And not surprisingly, they kind of ran out of time. But they came across as two really decent and authentic guys who had, they had a story to tell. And but they felt slightly, I guess, that people would struggle to take them seriously because their story was to do with pipe work and piping, rather than anything high tech and potentially digital based or data based, etc. But the story was remarkable because the story went back something like 20 odd years when Paul had first come up with the concept. The problem he was trying to fix was that when people are working on small diameter pipes, sometimes it's difficult to know that you're working on the right piece of pipe. And that could be a dangerous situation because obviously if you cut into something and it's full of explosives or hazardous chemicals and it's the wrong pipe, then you can just imagine what might happen. So finding a reliable way of solving that problem is what the two guys set out to do, and they did, and they came up with a solution that has gone from success to success. But it wasn't until they were able to tell that story behind where the idea had come from, why the idea had sat dormant for so long, and how they were eventually bringing it to life, and then how through some various really interesting field trials they were able to demonstrate that fundamentally this worked and solved the problem they were trying to solve. It really made the business proposition crystal clear and was the kind of springboard for them to take their business forward.
I think what was the most amazing thing about it, though, is just to watch them grow throughout the process. Because when we first saw them in the first of the classes that we do with TechX, the message was still confused. It was overly complex, but they listened very carefully, and that's the thing I would encourage anybody who's coming on this to do, is just listen very carefully to the component parts of how you put a great story together, and then how you convert that story through a pitch into something that's compelling and authentic and memorable for the audience that's in front of you.
Yeah.
Excellent. Now, probably as I'm thinking about it, I'd like to unpick that components of a story, but it would probably take the whole course and we don't want to give it all away. So I won't go too deep, but I guess for those who aren't so familiar with the storytelling method of how they communicate, a lot of the startups we work with are very technical, very engineer focused. We often see them start with, textbook pages of PowerPoint slides. And often by the end of the program, through those methods, they have these compelling stories that still get the same information across, but actually in a more compelling way. As startups evolve and they're maybe continuing in their business, what are some of the couple of nuggets? I'm sure there's hundreds, but a couple of nuggets from the storytelling method that you think would help at all stages of business, but that help people understand why that's so valuable?
Ed, I think if you go back historically, there was a time as Homo sapiens where we didn't necessarily have digital recording devices. We didn't have reading and writing. We didn't have, so all relied on verbal communication. And storytelling really comes down to this idea. It's the most efficient way of us transferring information from one person to another. If I tell you a story about something and it's an interesting story and it's something you go, wow, then you'll remember it. If I give you a list of data and say, you might say, wow, but you're not going to remember any of it for any length of time. So it's probably the oldest and the most reliable form of communication. And all we're doing is basically throwing back the cover and saying, in business, why wouldn't you use the most oldest and reliable form of communication in a really effective business way to help people to remember what you've said and to actually, take note of what you've said and potentially be convinced by what you've said?
Really helpful. So using that method, then it's the oldest and most effective way of doing it. If a startup was thinking, so let's say a startup comes to you, they've come out of TechX process and they're saying, we've got a sales call coming up. It's one of our first. We're really trying to get this pilot opportunity. What kind of steps would you take them through to try and help them take, possibly a big sales presentation? They want to talk about all their stats and their results to try and convert it into something that is that most natural form of communication.
Go on.
Yeah. I mean, when we break it down, it comes back to the simple thing: is what's the one or two clear messages you're trying to land. Often we find people trying to land 15 messages. And the problem with that is if you try and land 15 messages, none of them actually get remembered. So we come back to the essence that says, for that particular audience on that particular day, what are the key things you need to land with them? And let's strip everything else back. Now, if we can then convey some of the information in the form of a story, it becomes easy to consume and easy to remember. So stories are there as part of the persuasion process. They're not just standalone nice to haves that can fill in a conversation. These are essential elements because a story told well creates a picture in people's heads. So they can imagine what you're talking about. And if they can imagine what you're talking about, that's far more graphic than any PowerPoint slide that I can put together using AI or not. If they're converting that into their head, they're taking part in the presentation with you. And therefore, they have a commitment to that they don't get simply by sitting watching a number of slides going past in front of them. If we can get that level of engagement from an early stage startup business with a customer with a really clear and simple message, then if the product is good and it will benefit the customer, they're more likely to say yes to it than a jumbled message or too many messages all given at once.
We're working with a lot of entrepreneurs around Scotland at the moment, Ed, and I find myself every time I'm talking to them now just closing my eyes and just listening to what they have to say, because each and every one at this kind of start out phase, they just, there's so much information. They cram it all onto a slide. And as you probably know, we read a lot faster than we speak. So you're way ahead of what's happening and not making sense of it, because actually the expert is telling you, but you're not listening. So my advice is when you're doing anything for the first time, is just sit and listen to yourself with your eyes shut. And actually see if you're getting the message across without anything at all. And then the secret beyond that is to start to produce yourself in a way where you're adding different layers onto the cake. So whether it's props or just the slides that are necessary, that's the way to build this up to a point where actually you're only telling people what they really need to know. So many times we just see people bombard us with information and we walk out of the room going, I don't know what they wanted.
Yep.
Yeah, I can't deny we have heard that a few times from some of the startup presentations we've seen. So let's keep with that example of a startup thinking about a big big pilot meeting or a big sales conversation. They're really interested in it. Probably one of the first things they're going to want to dive into right away is a big explanation of the technology. Here's what it is. Here's why it works. Really exciting. We're the best thing since sliced bread. How would you then break that down? So you've probably seen lots of different ways. We see it on TechX of how startups have done really clever things to improve that detailed explanation of the technology to make it more compelling. What are some examples of things that you would say to startups to make that technology explanation section of their presentation much more compelling?
Is that not a good point for a story? So whether it's a startup or whether you're actually in business a long time, it's the same.
It's the same thing. I mean, you're generally trying to take something complex and make it easy to understand. So let me give you an example on that, for instance. So this would be back in 2005, a long, long time ago. I was trying to raise some money to do a business deal. And the problem I had was the people I was approaching to raise money didn't know who I was. They didn't know my company. They didn't know the sector. And I wanted to raise money from them. And I thought, well, how do I make this investment proposition simple enough for them to understand? So I went in to meet a group of bankers. First time I'd met them, they didn't know who I was at all. And I asked them a simple question, what's the single biggest specimen from nature, from the world of plants and animals? And they looked at me as if I had two heads. And they humored me and they said, is it a whale? I said, no, it's not a whale. I said, think plants and animals. And they went, oh, okay, plants. It'll be, is it this fungus that grows for 3 kilometers? I said, no, plants and animals doesn't include fungus. That's why I specifically said those two phylum. So they said, well, okay, it'll be a tree then. It'll be a tree. It'll be the Californian redwood tree, the sequoia. I said, absolutely. So I then said, I want you to imagine you're walking through a forest of giant redwoods. And I got them to close their eyes and I got them to imagine they were walking across these pine needles and they could smell the nice pine freshness and they could see that they could hear birds in the distance. They could see plants growing in front of, things like that. And then when I said that, and I want you to imagine that growing between two really large pine trees is a small Scots pine, and it's a small shrub. And I want you to open your eyes. And when they opened your eyes, of course, I had my Scots pine in my hand. Now, this looks as though it's a £5 thing from Amazon at Christmas. That's deceptive. This is actually, a really healthy Scots pine that's growing here. And I said, I want you to imagine that you carefully lift that Scots pine with all its roots up, because it's competing for sunlight, it's competing for moisture, it's competing for nutrients, and you take it into a clearing somewhere and you put it in a hole that you've dug, and you put the soil back round about it and you give it a drink and you stand back and you let it grow. And what happens? Well, it grows. Of course it grows, but it grows much more quickly than it did when it was surrounded by the giant redwood trees. And I said, and that is my business plan. And on the back of that, they gave me $280 million to go and buy out a business from a large American corporation.
Wow. It's so powerful. I love that example. And I think we often see the engineers in the room. The sessions often start and they kind of go, oh, I don't get it. And then something like that, when they can see it in practice, it really lights it up. So maybe let's dive into metaphor then, because I think that's a great example of one way to translate. So you've touched on props. We can go into a bit more of that, but equally just metaphor and comparison. If you were one of these energy startups, you've seen loads of them. Where do you start? Do you start with a big brainstorm? How do they kind of come up with something that kind of still has the essence of what they want to say, but maybe they can't think of it?
A couple of things is, if you're too close to it, it's sometimes difficult to say, well, it's unique and it's complete. It's got no analogies. It's got no metaphors that describe it. Therefore, you need to. It's a group exercise that involves people that are not involved in the depth of the technical stuff you're doing. I'll give you an example of this. So, for instance, we were working with Andrew Parfrey when he was running CareSourcer. And CareSourcer was a startup business that he was trying to kind of get off the ground. And Andrew described it as a catalogue for homes for the elderly, which made it sound incredibly old-fashioned and difficult. when we got to the bottom of it, we said, actually, it's not a catalogue at all. It's like booking.com for homes for the elderly. Went, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah. So it completely transformed the thinking about this was a dynamic, data-driven, information-rich approach that could give people up-to-date availability of places, etc. Whereas he described it as a book that sat on a coffee table. So having the right metaphor sometimes means somebody outside looking in and saying, oh, that's a bit like, and they'll describe it and you go, yeah, I suppose it is when you put it that way. The other thing, of course, is nowadays we've all got access to AI and to the internet, etc. It doesn't take long dodging about on these tools to come up with things that say, yeah, that is actually quite like what you said it is. So trying to find the analogies and the metaphors is probably easier now than it's ever been. But people often dismiss the metaphor because it doesn't describe every feature of the product. And also the metaphor only describes one element of it. And you think, that's okay. That's okay, because you're not wanting the metaphor to describe everything about your business. You're just wanting it to describe a principle or one benefit or one feature, so that you say it's a bit like, you know. So, you know, one of the previous TechX cohorts we were talking about, and the guys were saying that, you know, they developed this drone enhancement to allow them to go and inspect wind turbines, but do it from a distance. So potentially you could do it from onshore rather than having to take boats and vessels offshore. And it wasn't really until we got into it that they described that their inspiration came from the flight of the kestrel. And we thought, there's the metaphor.
Yeah.
The kestrel doesn't fight the wind, the kestrel uses the wind. And that's how you get the extra energy to be able to get all the way out to the wind turbines, do your inspection and fly back again on battery power effectively, because you're behaving like a kestrel rather than behaving like a drone. And we thought, there you go. You've caught, in essence, what makes this different.
But the first stage in all of this production, as we like to call it, Ed, is that part that you said right at the beginning. You need to sit down in a room with people, give it your best shot, let them listen to it, and take the feedback that you're getting. Because from that, and only from that, can you start to develop what's right, what's wrong, what you need to chuck out, what you need to bring in order to grow this story. So that whole process of either recording yourself doing it and listening back to it, and then opening it up to a coterie of people who you know and who you trust, who will give you the right feedback, not just it's nice, but will actually give you something meaningful to do something with it.
Yeah.
And I think it's so interesting as they start to evolve beyond it. A lot of the startups maybe crack that first metaphor and example and kind of stick to it. But actually, as you were talking about, it's got me thinking in that analogy with the Scots pine, knowing who the other audience is, because if you were pitching that to a group where their number one priority was, let's say, American investment opportunities, and it was about growing the American economy, probably that metaphor of a Scots pine and trying to help the small Scottish company would not have hit the mark at all.
No, exactly. I would have turned it. What was that cherry tree that George Washington chopped down? It would be a baby cherry tree at that time. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So how do startups then figure out what is the right kind of, you spoke about it should just be one feature, one benefit, one service. When they're going into that field trial or that customer meeting, you know, should they be flexing this, and how do they know which one to focus on to make sure it has the best impression?
I mean, I guess this is what rehearsals are all about, Ed. I mean, if you go in there without rehearsing, you're taking a risk. And if you rehearse in front of your close workmates, then you're not getting any valid input. You need to find somebody that represents the type of audience that you're going to speak to, and hit them cold with it and say, look, I'm going to present to you for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, whatever it happens to be. And I'd really like to get your impression of what you would say if you were this type of customer. So that they sit there thinking, wow, what have I just seen? What have I just listened to? Did it convince me? Did it not convince me? Which bits actually did I understand? Which bits did you lose me on? So you get real quality feedback. And if you don't get that feedback, you're taking, as I say, you're taking such a risk. Why would you do it? I would say the same when it comes to any significant public presentation. Why would you stand up at a conference and present without having done at least one rehearsal, if not two or three, so that you can learn from the feedback and improve your product? So feedback is your friend. Failing to rehearse is just you're cutting corners unnecessarily.
It's the thing we come across time and time again. If you think about it, look at musicians, look at actors, look at comedians, people who we go out and pay money to see. The question is, why don't we do the same in business? They practice and rehearse thousands of times before they appear in front of anybody. And our question is, why don't people do that in business?
Yeah, and we've asked that many times, and we've both been part of organizations where that's been the practice. And I found myself in some organizations where I would be setting up rehearsals for presentations that I knew other people were going to participate in, and they had elected not to rehearse because they knew what they were doing. And I thought, wow. I certainly know my material, but it doesn't mean to say it's going to come across well unless I've actually tried it out. In extreme, I had one situation where I prepared for a talk and I did a rehearsal, and thank goodness I did, because as a result of that rehearsal, I threw the whole talk away. I was trying to be, it was for the International Association of Drilling Contractors, and I was trying to be a bit edgy, and I was trying to be a bit controversial, but it actually came across as deeply respectful, but I couldn't see it from the inside. It needed somebody to hold the mirror up and saying, Bob, you don't really want to say that, do you? I'm saying, why? It actually comes across as being quite rude, quite aggressive, and I'm going, nah. I'd missed the tone completely. Thankfully, it was in a rehearsal, so I still had time to throw it away and start again. Yeah.
Really helpful. So if we think about that startup preparing for a big sales meeting or a pitch, so we've got a sense of, we can maybe use an analogy or a prop or some way of kind of articulating what the technology is. Again, anecdotally, the next thing they typically tend to go is lots of data, lots of numbers, graphs, charts. Here's why it's so much more efficient. Here's why it'll save you this amount of money, lots of numbers. So let's unpick maybe that element of often either a slide or the talk where they're trying to present a lot of information and numbers. What are some tips they could use to try and make that, again, memorable and compelling?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first one's an obvious one. If you want me to remember more than 2 numbers or maybe 3 numbers, I'm not. So there's no point in giving me the same data in 15 different forms and 12 different case studies and expecting me to take anything away from it. Whereas if at the end of the day, you can leave me with 1 or maybe 2 key numbers that you want me to have, and these are the only numbers that I can go away saying this is 15% more efficient than any competitor, or this is 60% cheaper than the nearest alternative, whatever it happens to be that you're focusing on. So don't think that more numbers equals more clarity. And by all means, show me data, but tell me the story behind the data. Now, when you get financial presentations, often what you'll get is somebody thinks, I've got a graph here and I'm going to put 6 variables on the graph. And then you think, well, hang on a minute, it doesn't look busy enough. I'm going to put 4 graphs in quadrants round about the slides, each with 6 or 7 variables on them. And then when I present, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to say something. You can see clearly here, there's an inflection point occurred about 4 years ago. And I'm thinking, which corner is he looking at? Which color line is he looking at? And by the time you've figured that out, they're on to the next graph. So there's this fallacy that more information equals a better quality. What we would say is if you're going to show information on a graph, build it up in stages. So show the first part of the graph and say, at this point, things were going well. Then say, however, something happened and it didn't go well. And then something else happened. And this is what happened after that. And this is why it happened. So you tell the story behind the data.
If you look at it from a broadcast perspective, if you watch the news on a nightly basis, when they're talking about COVID, for instance, they didn't set up an Excel spreadsheet that gave you every last detail coming from every hospital. They had one simple graph that went up or down. And then the storyteller, i.e. the newsreader, sat and told you the story behind it. So we're exactly the same. All we want to see is something that gives us the data that pulls the lever in our head to go, yeah, we need to talk to that person more about that particular point. Not walking out of the room thinking, God, what did they want?
Yeah. I think one of the reasons startups maybe, and particularly in this early stage energy tech space, is they've come from universities or maybe they've come from research and they really have to back up every number. Their credibility rests on the data and the numbers. And there's this sense of almost, I don't know if imposter syndrome is the right word, but if they get into that meeting, they want to show you everything and they want to show the numbers. So how do startups get credibility across in those meetings, not just in the numbers, but as a team, because it's so important that this customer sees us as credible, not just the new kids on the block. one way they try to do that is to present you with every piece of data on the planet. What are some better ways they can make sure they come across as credible?
I think the key here is I mean, the mistake that some people do is they go in and say, well, I'll try and credentialize myself by telling you all the things that we've done and all what we've achieved and how many letters we've got after our name and how many awards we've had, etc. Another thing that people do is I'll try and impress you with lots and lots of information. The danger of lots of information is that you're more likely to confuse me rather than clarify it for me. And the danger with having lots of credentials and that is I'm thinking, well, so what? I don't even know you. And none of that really impresses me. What will impress me is tell me about things you've done. In fact, don't tell me about them, show me them. And you'll show me them in the form of a story is great. So if you tell me what was the aha moment that led to your technical breakthrough, that led to the product that's in front of me now, and why is that so special? And tell me the story behind that. I'm going to say, wow, I'm really impressed with that. Yes, of course, you're going to say, we've got all the data you like to back this up, and we can send you any information you like. But today, I want to concentrate on one element of that data. And I'm going to tell you why we struggled with this and how we managed to find it and how we refined it. And then how Charlie came along and he spotted something different. And then Sue came in and you're telling the story of the people and the product and the service in a way that people will understand and take away from that a clear message. And because you're showing people what you've done, that gives you credibility. Because you say, well, we did that. Yeah. But it's not boasting. It's actually telling the story, the journey that you've come on.
And that, going back to our first story with Paul, that's where they started. It was a personal story about him getting burnt by a piece of acid coming out of a pipe. And, at that point, they had nothing to show. They had no product to demonstrate. But people were interested in the fact that here's a guy telling a story about something that happened to him that in my head, if I'm sitting on the other side of the table going, wow, okay, right, he's been on that journey. He understands it. Therefore, he has the depth and the knowledge to do something with it.
Yeah, that helps a lot. I think that's definitely one of the quick themes I wanted to pick up there, because I guess the next part that would come up is typically a team slide with lots of different, degrees and experience and careers. And kind of, you've spoken about that challenge between selling the technology and selling the team. So you kind of touched on this quite a lot already, but what ways can they make sure that they show that breadth of experience of the team to make it compelling to the industry customer or to the field trial partner?
Yeah. So what we sometimes see in startups is there can be 3 people in the company and they've all got a C in the front of their job title. So we've got the CEO, the CFO, and the CTO all there. I always thought to be a chief executive, you had to have executives. And one of them had to be allocated as being the chief at the time. So when people use these kind of terminology, actually, for me, it slightly makes their credibility a little bit less rather than higher. But again, rather than telling me everybody's qualifications, because I do expect nowadays most people will have some sort of qualification, etc. Where in the story did these people appear that made them special? What was it they brought to the team that actually was the insight that allowed this business to move forward? Whether that's financial, whether that's technological, whether it's technical skills, whatever it happens to be, what's their part in the story? And therefore I'll remember them as being a character in the story rather than the worst we see is people calling their team, we've got a rock star team. And people have used that terminology in presentations, and we're thinking, unless Elton John appears on the next slide, we won't be convinced by this. And needless to say, he didn't. Yeah.
That's why simply in our organization, Ed, he's the brains and I'm the getaway driver. That's how we describe ourselves, okay?
I think that personality needs to come through. I mean, we see hundreds of applications every year to TechX, and that's something we always advise is actually, when we see versions of it where, it is just almost a CV for each person. I'm so-and-so professor of this, and here's my 10 qualifications, and then another video with but the ones where they're actually together, introducing each other, talking, showing that personality, giving a little bit of life to it, can really help. So imagining this point, the startups, they've hopefully done that brainstorming, figured out some analogies, they've done a few rehearsals, they've kind of got their materials together, they've kind of thought through how they're going to talk about their team. The other hard part that comes with often these types of commercial ones is at the end, you've got to make an ask. You've got to actually compellingly persuade someone to continue the conversation or to buy the product. So talk to us how to best communicate that in a respectful way without being too salesy, or maybe you should be too salesy. You should be straight to the point. What do you think works best?
Yeah, well, there's a few things in there. Firstly, before you go into any situation like that, clearly you should have thought through beforehand, what is it we're going to ask for? As you say, it could be a follow-up meeting, it could be a product demonstration, it could be a sale, it could be whatever. But let's be clear on what we're going to ask for. But here's the second thing is, what happens if it becomes clear during the meeting that that's not available? What are we going to do? Panic and run out of the room is one option. Make it up on the spot and hopefully randomly find the right answer is another answer. Or think about it beforehand and have a fallback. Yeah. So having that fallback in mind is always a good thing to do. And then the process we take people through involves answering a number of questions during that pitch. Once we get to most of those questions having been answered, we get towards the end of the pitch. Instead of going straight for the jugular and saying, buy one of these from us now, we would always encourage people to say, let's pause and let's have a little bit of reflection into the room and let's ask the audience an open question about what they've just heard. So that might be something like, how do you think this product could work within your organization? So it's a nice open question. There's no simple one-word answer to it. And what that does is it flushes out the gaps that you might have left, that you might not know about. It also flushes out an idea as to whether or not they're ready to commit. And it also gets people the chance to say things positive about you in front of their colleagues. So it reinforces the message that you've just landed. And then on the back of that, you can make the call as to whether we're going to ask for what we came for or whether we're going to go to the fallback. So the engineers would love that because it's a methodology there that says, this is how you know how to finish your pitch. So it's not A to B. It does depend on what happens during the pitch as well.
The other part of that we'd love to encourage people to think about is, once you've finished your pitch, what kind of questions are you going to get thrown at you? And it's a place that we find time and time again, people they pay no heed to what happens. They get to the end of the pitch and they go, oh God, that's it. Thank God for that. We've delivered the pitch. And then all of a sudden somebody stands up in the audience and asks them the worst question they could possibly get. So we'd like people to start thinking about, how do you answer those stinger questions that are going to come at you at some point?
Yeah. So then we'll maybe explore that a little bit, but as we zoom out of this sort of scenario, this sales scenario, we've kind of done that maybe 10-minute, 15-minute presentation. We've explained the technology. We've talked through the team. We've given that ask. Taking a step out of that, what often startups will want to send the slide pack, or the slide pack will almost be the sales proposal, or there'll be some sort of email in advance where they say, here's our proposal, can we have a meeting? And then they click through the same proposal. Just in terms of collateral and slides and what you send and should you send it and should you send it in advance? Yeah. Probably a lot of questions in that, but just what's best practice in terms of how to navigate all these different documents? And
so if I could take your seventh question first there, Ed.
What's the only seven?
Now, when you think about it, if you're standing in front of somebody and you're presenting, that's a kind of a face-to-face communication. If you're sending somebody to read, it's a completely different form of communication. So when I go to read a magazine, I don't expect it to be a series of PowerPoint slides. I expect it to be a narrative with pictures and illustrations, etc. So I would always encourage people to say, if you're going to send something in writing, design it for that channel, that mode of communication. If, however, and this does happen, people say, send me your slides, then it would be rude not to. However, simple one here, have two versions of your slides. Have a sending version that's got lots of explanatory notes on it and all the diagrams are complete and filled and it's easy to read and absorb at your leisure. And have a second version is the kind that you would present to, where you would strip back a lot of the unnecessary text. You would present things as build-ups and sequences rather than all at the same time. And you'd probably have fewer of them than you would potentially in a full deck that you're going to send to somebody. So think about it based on the audience and how they're going to consume that information and design it accordingly.
Excellent. So yes, making sure that you're thinking about the different channels. And then very briefly, we've touched on this a little bit, but just around other things like props and collateral, how do you prepare for that? And is that effective?
What we find is that you've got I mean, if you're in a competitive process, for instance, one of your obligations is to be remembered for the right reason. And often that means getting people's attention. I've been involved in places where we were the sixth bidder to go into a room of a client, and the client by this time is completely worn out by all the kind of false promises and everything they've heard. So how would you get their attention? And some of that is at the start of a conversation, potentially doing something that's a little bit different, a little bit more kind of heads up, interesting. That can involve props, for instance. So for instance, I have a prop here. I have used this prop several times. And I usually start using this prop with something along the lines of, it was 2,300 years ago in Syracuse in Sicily, where Archimedes discovered the displacement principle. And he famously jumped up in the bath at that point in time, completely naked, and shouted, "Eureka." And Eureka was Greek for "I've found it" or "I've got it." So today we'd like to recreate that. No. Today I'd like to share with you 3 Eureka moments about the product I'm about to tell you with. So you see how we've taken the prop and we've used it as somebody who's bored, not listening. All of a sudden they're getting nudged by the person next to them because there's a guy in front of them standing with a rubber duck, and you think, but you're doing it to make sure everybody's paying attention, and you're doing it really to make sure that people understand. And it's not facile, it's not bolted on. It has to be something that leads you into the story or the talk in that way. So I've used all sorts of different props. A banana is one of my favorite because I talk about DNA and core values and various things around about that. But I've used all sorts of different props where they fit the need. And often it's the difference between people pay attention and not paying attention. If you have got a product that can be demonstrated, well, then why show pictures? Demonstrate the product. You know, it's simple stuff like that. If you're selling vacuum cleaners at somebody's doorway, you don't want to say, "Can I borrow your computer so we can do a PowerPoint presentation on the new vacuum cleaner?" You want to say, "Give me a plug and I'll vacuum your rug for you." So it's that thinking through is what is it's most likely to convince people that what you're saying is true and genuine and really impressive, and deliver it in that way. This is why stories are such a powerful element in that, because stories create the pictures inside people's heads. So I can tell you a story about something without you being there, and you go, "Oh yeah, I get it. Yeah, I get it. I can see that happening. I can imagine myself there." And therefore that's way more powerful than trying to show them pictures on a graph.
You just can't underestimate the time that you should take to produce your story and your product is absolutely crucial. Because if you don't take that time to craft each and every word that comes out of your mouth and craft each and every detail, whether it's a prop or a slide or a demonstration, then you're just wasting people's time. Okay, so I think when we come to meet some of you, down the road here next year, we'd love you to just take the time to think in a lot more detail about your product. And imagine you're on the other side of the table and hearing yourselves that, are you actually convincing yourselves about what you're talking? Because if you aren't, then we're never going to be convinced. So take the time, build the detail into everything you do, and craft it in a way that it becomes a little show in its own right, without it being a show, that just makes us pull those little levers in our head and go, yeah, we want to work with these people. Wow, why would we not?
Yeah, being remembered as that team with the duck. Remember them versus what was the third one we saw? I don't remember anything about what they said. It's so much better.
So, I mean, Ed, can I a quick story on that?
Yeah.
Walking through Aberdeen Airport, guy comes up to me, points me in the chest and says, "You're Bob Keiller." I said, "Yeah, I am. How can I help you?" He said, "I've always wanted to speak to you." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you did a presentation at Offshore Europe 2 years ago, and I remember it." I said, "Well, I'm glad you do, but so why is that an important thing?" He says, "I never, ever remember presentations, but I remember you did one on your 7 core values." He says, "And you had the hat and you had the coat hanger and your jar of honey." And I'm going, yeah, I remember it. I said, "What do you remember of the other 2 guys that were doing the presentation at that event?" He said, "I don't remember. There was 2 other guys." So he'd completely forgotten they existed. He said he remembered my talk from 2 years prior, but what he'd forgotten, it wasn't 2 years prior, it was 8 years before that the talk had taken place, and he claimed to remember it. And that was a talk based on 2 things, stories, and each story had a separate prop.
And that's how Bob and I met, because I was one of the other speakers. But Bob's just described beautifully there, because when he actually tells that story in stage or in a room, we have the slide of the airport, we have the little movements in terms of how he talks to people. He brings the whole thing to life, so that when people walk away from that, you hear them at coffee time going, "Bob, that was a great story. Did that yeah?" So just craft it, build it, create it, so that your little memory here goes, "Yeah, I get that.
I get it. I'll remember it."
Yeah. And I like to hope that, I think in most cases this will land and it'll be impactful. But I guess startups fear, maybe why won't they lean into it? It seems so obvious. Why would you not have this prepared? I guess the two that come up most often is, God, it takes a lot of time. And two, this is just not what people are expecting. They kind of just want to see my big boring slides, or maybe what if people don't like it and they'll push back and they'll kind of challenge. What's your reaction to those two criticisms of maybe using storytelling?
So the first one about time is easy one. If it's important to you, you should put the time. And if it's not important to you, don't bother. So reserve your efforts for your important stuff. I mean, if you're going to try and go and land a customer or land some investment or encourage new talent onto your team, it's pretty important stuff. You don't want to go in there ill-prepared. You don't want to go in there under-invested in the activity. You want to be in a place where you give yourself the best chance of a successful outcome. So the time commitment is one about personal choice. If you're not doing that, you're doing something even more important. However, if that's the future of your business or your enterprise, maybe you should be putting your effort into that. The second one, people talk themselves out of it because they watch what's happening round about them and copy them. There's the old analogy about, if you put a bunch of crabs in a bucket and one tries to escape, the others pull it back in. That's a bit like what we talk about here, is if you're the crab that's trying to escape out of the bucket and everybody else at the conference has got a slide that starts off with their corporate mission and values and a map showing where they all operate and all that kind of stuff, and that it feels the right thing to do to comply with that. But in reality, all you're doing is you're making yourself like everybody else, therefore less memorable, less distinct. So why would you do that? I will say it does screw up conference organizers when you turn up with no slides, which I've done several times. And they think, but you must have slides. Don't you know how this works? I'm saying, yeah, I do know how it works. And I've spent more time crafting my 15-minute presentation than most, I'm sure. And then you deliver it and people say, wow, that was brilliant. We understood every single word. I said, it didn't need pictures this time. Other times it does. So if it does need them, we put them there.
We talked to 650 anaesthetists at the Aberdeen P&J Live a few weeks ago. That took 3 weeks of rehearsal. 3 weeks of rehearsal to do a 40-minute on-stage talk. It's like the Rolling Stones. They're not going to turn up for their final world farewell tour without having gone into a room for at least a month, 2 months, and started playing songs that they know inside out. So exactly the same methodologies we said at the beginning. If it matters, you're going to have to spend time on it. And
if you want to be different, don't be the same as everybody else.
Yeah, pretty clear. I like it. And I think I like that analogy of the musician, because I think there's a lot of tools that people can use, because even a lot of startups think, right, I've done the pitch presentation, I've put all my curation into that. And then, as you say, we get to questions and it's, a free for all. But equally, if you've got that toolbox, if you've built up those stories, then you can build them into the questions. What are some of the tips around that questioning piece where some of these things can come into it?
Yeah. So, I mean, the best thing is practice your questions, the toughest questions, not the easy questions. So, for instance, when I used to run a listed company, we practiced for 3 hours the day before we did any 6 monthly financial results presentations, and that was a 15-minute Q&A we were rehearsing for. So 3 hours rehearsal for a 15-minute Q&A. But there's also a thing in there is that if somebody says to you, I think your product's not as good as your competitor, the temptation is to say you're wrong and contradict the person. If you do that, then potentially you're setting off defensive alarm bells that says, I can't work with you because you contradict me. There's a better move that says, well, actually, when somebody else told us the same thing recently, this is what happened, and you tell them the story about the issue rather than you being right versus me being wrong. And you say, and during that discussion, this happened, then that happened. And eventually we agreed that we were looking at it from slightly different perspectives. And that's why, in essence, the client was absolutely right to say on that point they were wrong, but they hadn't taken the full picture into account. Once we explained that, it was clearer to them. Does that help? So it's effectively like a judo move. What you've done is you've moved both of you onto the same side of the table and put the issue on the other side rather than the two of you being confrontational across the table.
And interesting enough, when we do the kind of stinger question thing when we're live with people in the room, it actually allows them to think about things that they have never actually thought about before. And again, going right back to the beginning, take all of those and changing the presentation in a way that actually doesn't get them into that hole at the end.
Yeah.
So it's a great exercise in just letting all the kind of rabbits out of the holes that you need so you know what you're doing.
I think I love the comparison of both the musicians, but equally comedians, performers, even high-end politicians. You know, how many TV shows have we seen where there's a preparation for the presidential debate and they're grilling and they're doing all sorts of, and they've got the person on the other side pretending to be. I mean, if you're standing up on stage in front of 1,000 people at an energy conference, why would you not equally want that same level of preparation?
Correct.
Yeah. Really helpful. And is there any, again, you've touched on this quite a lot and we're almost running out of time, but some of those persuasive tricks that can kind of help, whether that's through the pitch or the story, or kind of what are the things that can either pull on the heartstrings or pull on the brain, or what can startups do to try and make sure that through the communication, they are psychologically making sure their message is landing?
So a couple of things I would say on that, Edward. One is, if you're going to tell stories, they need to be based on true events.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore you need to tell them in such a way as people believe them to be true. So they have to have enough detail in them for people to understand that. And they need to be able to kind of picture what you're talking about. So don't give them a completely alien scenario or that they just won't understand. The second thing is people need to care. And why are they going to care? And therefore you need to think about what's the source of empathy that you're drawing on when you're presenting. If you stand up and say, we're brilliant, we're fantastic at everything we do, and we never make a mistake, it's unlikely that people empathize with that. Where if you say, we're only human, we struggle at times, we sometimes don't get it right, but we learn quickly, they go, yeah, a bit like me. So already they're empathizing. So there's lots of sources of empathy that we can talk about when we talk to people about business storytelling that makes the audience care about the story you're telling them. Because if they don't care, they won't remember.
Yeah. And if you were to bump into any of our lovely TechX alumni a couple of years post TechX and you're kind of hearing from them, let's hope they're taking all this on board. And maybe you've covered a lot of these points, but is there any other points that we haven't covered that maybe you would bring up as sort of red flags where you might be going, if you to see them presenting today, 3 years post program, you'd be going, now remember, don't do this, or actually get rid of that slide. Is there a couple of things that brew to the top of your head that you're like, get rid of that?
Yeah, for me, it's this idea of every presentation should be designed for the audience on that day, not a slide deck that you throw together and just put in front of people. And if you don't rehearse, then you're taking a huge risk.
You took the words right out of my mouth.
It's malt loaf.
Just be as memorable as you possibly can. Authentic in that, but be memorable. So do something that's going to make me sit up and take notice and continue to want to listen and want to engage with you. Because if at the end of the day, you're trying to get money out of my pocket, you've got to do something special for me to put you in that top 10 where I'm going, why would I want to be anywhere else other than with these people?
Fantastic. Make me care. Make you care. I love it. So we've covered lots in there. Some of that is stuff that many of our startups will go through that delightful process through the accelerator to curate their pitch for their demo day. But equally in that commercial setting, so much of the messaging transpires, trying to make sure that you're making it clear, making it memorable, making sure that you're making people care. So thank you both so much for your time. I know you work with loads of different startups and your time's very precious. And as we can see behind you, you're also working on not just trying to help startups, but reinventing the city centre of Aberdeen, which is another just a side thing, just a little extra.
And clearly we haven't paid the electricity bill because the lights.
It's all right. We've got some renewable energy startups that I'm sure would be delighted to.
Exactly. They can solve our problem.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much. And thanks for those who've watched along either in the recording or along live. This is part of the EnergyTech Essentials series from the TechX team at the Net Zero Technology Center, where we're trying to just give you some practical insights to some of the key skills and capabilities you might need to build an energy technology business. So we're hugely grateful to the partners like AB15 who support and facilitate this program that has supported probably over 80, 90 startups now at this point to be able to put these skills into practice and hopefully change our energy system. So pay attention for further EnergyTech Essentials sessions with other partners covering various topics from investment, technology development, business storytelling, but in the digital realm with another one of our partners to use social selling. So thank you both so much. Thanks for those who've watched along, and good luck with developing your businesses and changing the world. See you all later.
Bye.